So hello, it's a delight to be here, and it's been particularly great to listen into much of this conference and take advantage of the great insight, the candor, and also just the energy level, which is moving and exciting. We're going to hear from three very different philanthropists who operate from a different or lead different philanthropies, I should probably say. They, like you, are illustration of the ways in which philanthropy is being sort of reimagined before our very eyes. And so we'll get a sense of how they're going about philanthropy, but also the directions that they think we should be, they hope that the field will go into. Like you, they're believers in proximate philanthropy. Like you, they're trying to build a just recovery from the pandemic, from its economic effects, but also think through how we move forward on long overdue racial reckoning that's underway. So I'm going to introduce them very quickly. We're going to start with Marla Blow. Marla is president and COO of the Skoll Foundation. She comes out of a background, she's worked in all three sectors. So just before coming to Skoll, she was the North American lead for the MasterCard Center for Inclusive Growth, which is in essence a think tank within a corporation. It is a sort of a combination of those two worlds. You can tell me if I've got that wrong, Marla. She started her own venture, which was a credit card venture that was designed to bring sort of traditional credit to those who might otherwise have been excluded. I should also say that she worked in the public sector, in government. She helped stand up the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau and, in fact, serve in it. I guess when I think of Marla, I think of somebody who knows all three sectors and knows their power when they come together. So it'll be fun to hear from her. Vilas Dhar is president of the Patrick J. McGovern Foundation. It seeks to harness technology to the goals of social change, of social justice, of equity, and sustainability. He comes from an equally complicated background, and that is to say that he's an entrepreneur, he's a technologist, he's a human rights advocate. So he comes at the problems we'll talk about from a unique and powerful perspective. We hear from him often when it comes to the whole issue of how technology can contribute to social change. And Karen Ansara, she and her husband Jim started the Ansara Family Fund at the Boston Foundation. And in 2010, she co-founded the Haiti Fund, also within the Boston Foundation. They have focused on, they've committed to place and focused largely on Haiti, where 65% of the population is living in poverty. And so their focus is on poverty, but she'll be quick to say to you that poverty is not one single issue, it is many. So I'm going to start with you, Karen. And you were very moved the other day by Malala's words when she talked about listening and learning and sharing what you've learned. So I wanted a sense from you, why did that touch such a chord with you? And how do you go about listening and learning?
Well, I guess it touched a chord with me because when we first got involved with Haiti, my husband and I, we really didn't know anything about Haiti. And we learned very quickly that we didn't. Jim was able to be on the ground building a hospital, and so he learned very quickly. I had the privilege of being embedded at the Boston Foundation, which, as you mentioned, created the Haiti Fund. And I got to learn from members of the Haitian diaspora who were leading that fund, and gave me a window into the world of Haiti and the context of Haiti that I never could have gotten from reading proposals. They also took me on a dozen trips to Haiti where I came to understand that entrenched poverty, multi-generational poverty, is rooted in a tangle of factors, everything from gender-based violence to environmental degradation to underfunded healthcare to colonialism to racism to denial of basic human rights. So I learned from those who had lived the problems and were committed to making a change. I also have learned from working with intermediary organizations that I think are incredible resources because they've got the partners on the ground, they know the landscape, they know the leaders, they can marry their technical expertise and funding with the passion of local leaders. And so I learn a lot from them as well.
Yeah. And Marla, we've heard a lot about the whole notion of proximate philanthropy, of supporting proximate leaders. In essence, people who are of the community, who know the community's assets, know the solutions the community brings and devises and brings to bear. And I know Skoll has been not only supportive of proximate leaders, but has also been best known from the day it began for its strategy of identifying key change makers, social entrepreneurs, providing them the support to pursue their ideas and turn them into sort of actualities. And I know we've talked about over the past 3 days a lot about transferring power. What Skoll does is provide unrestricted support over a multi-year period. Talk about the concept of transferring power in that sense and the kinds of leaders these are.
Absolutely. Yeah, thank you, Jane. And I think you hit the nail right on the head, right? Our view on this is we have really looked for the nonconformists, right? The people that, as was just mentioned, have the experience, have lived this reality, and are best positioned to be able to really see these problems in new ways, be able to see solutions that might be invisible to those that are not quite as close or that do not have necessarily the lived experience. And they come up with things that might be hidden in plain sight. And in many instances, the communities that we are looking at have come up with ways internally, in some respects, to live around some of these problems. And sometimes there's opportunity to take some of those, I would actually dare call them innovations that those communities have come up with, right? That savvy that they've developed themselves in order to navigate, and turn that into a scalable, broader use solution, maybe with some incremental funding, incremental capacity, with some technology in some cases. Some of those solutions can be turned into really important and kind of breakthrough answers to some deeply entrenched questions. And the way we look at this now over the past 15 years that Skoll has been active in this space is we have been able to demonstrate that the solutions that come from those who are most closely placed really are the right levers for transformational social change. As we look at all the ways that we provide both the funding, also though the connectivity, the relationships, the profile, we champion and really advocate for and support these entrepreneurs, that puts them in a position to call on resources beyond the financial investment itself and really look at how we catalyze cross-sector collaboration in order to elevate the stories and the profile of the most promising solutions that we've come across. So we really look at this as embedding these entrepreneurs in a much larger community and an ecosystem, really, that crosses geography, it crosses discipline, it's across sector boundaries, and enable them to really take advantage of the knowledge that might be resident even in adjacent spaces. And that really for us includes looking at inclusive economies, racial justice, pandemics, and health systems, and how there is interaction across all of those. And we'll look at the ways that all of these opportunities can be met with some social innovation and some systems level thinking to address the root causes.
So everyone, I'm looking off to the side. I think we might just be experiencing some technical difficulties, but the little magician's trick, maybe I can just jump in knowing a little bit of what Jane was about to ask me. And before I do that, let me just say what a joy it is to be in a room with Karen Ansara, Marla Blow, and Jane Wales, 3 women from whom I have learned so much and always have such a good time. Marla, I wanted to pick up on that last bit that you talked about and just share one additional bit of sleight of hand that I should confess to. I run a foundation called the Patrick J. McGovern Foundation that in our purpose statement talks about using technology and particularly artificial intelligence and data science to create a better world. But the sleight of hand is this: we use those technologies and even those terms really to start a new conversation that's really much more about dignity and equity and justice. It's not so often that those words are used together. How do we use tools of really what are lines of code on a computer screen to come back to, I think, what Jane called a long overdue reckoning about the basic structures of power? As we think about AI, as we think about data science, these are not simply tools that help us build products or create services. But for the first time, they create a possibility for us to really conceptualize what it would mean to have something like universal access to healthcare. This is a principle, a right, a conversation we've had for half a century or more. But for the first time, we can envision a world where every single person on the planet has access to an AI-enabled chatbot that gets them access to a clinical care of some sort. We think about education and say, we've often said fundamental access to education should be a human right. But the realization of that has taken us to a place where finally technology maybe makes that a possible reality. So when we think about what our particular mode of action is as a foundation, we're happy, optimistic, and excited to think about what technology creates for us. But at its fundamental core is a storyline that says, how do we use this new set of opportunities that are being created to do something we should have done 50 years ago? To really reevaluate how we allocate resources across society. How do we let people participate in the economic opportunity that's created by our growth? How do we make sure that social, political, cultural structures are resilient and adapt accordingly to the new opportunities that are ahead of us? And in that construct, it strikes me that there's the private sector building things and government regulating it, and a really significant role for civil society and philanthropy to play, to step in and say, we protect the interests of those who are most vulnerable, certainly, but really of humanity as a whole. And I think a lot about what it means to be an engaged philanthropist, to say we take this rather abstract, metaphorical set of tools and try to put them in constructive comparison and use with the populations that we all care about so deeply in our social change work. So maybe I'll pause there, and maybe Karen, back to you. I know that in our conversation, you and I have talked a lot about technology as kind of the thing that we might see as one possible intervention, but of course there are many more. I wonder if that strikes any kind of provocations for you, or what you'd like to talk about next.
Well, I work in a context where there often isn't access to technology. So the first thing is we just got to get the wiring in there, right? We got to get the solar panels in there. We've got to get the equipment in there. And then a lot can happen, of course, in Haiti in that respect. But I think that, one of the topics that I was so interested in us talking about today is how do we marry that, or how do we balance our capacity to change other people's lives overseas? What is our role in intervening in another culture? Is it our place as philanthropists to do that, to change other people's cultures and lives? Or not? And I think Malala in particular wrestled with this quite a bit with us. And I will never forget a close friend of mine who comes from Kenya who said, when I posed this question to her, I said, is it our place to go into a place like Kenya and teach people that there shouldn't be female genital mutilation? And she said, if we don't have outsiders coming in to teach those things, we will be in the same situation we've always been in. And so I really believe that many of the problems we are dealing with, including those entrenched poverty, have to do with the denial of basic human rights. And it's often because people don't know their rights. They have not been taught their rights. They've been deprived their rights. Somebody has to be there to fund organizations that are going to teach basic human rights. And then the homegrown champions can emerge, the Malalas and the others that she's funded and that other intermediary organizations have funded. But we need to develop those local leaders, not just the leaders from the outside, and frankly, not just social entrepreneurs with great big ideas, but people who are coming from the community.
Absolutely. And I think one of the really interesting pieces of Karen about what you just mentioned is the knowledge that you develop by your long relationship in a particular place, right? The importance of place, understanding the assets within that community, and bringing that perspective with the rich appreciation of not just what you observe, but what you know about the customs and practices and history of that place, right? That puts you in a position to be really credible and really thoughtful and sensitive and nuanced, which I think is really, really important as we go about practicing philanthropy. And I have tremendous respect for that kind of focus in a particular place. I'd build on that by talking about at Skoll, where we are much broader, and we do look at global issues and think much more extensively about the systems that drive some of the experiences that may be happening in local place. And for us, we really think long and hard about all of the levers that we have at our disposal in making change in this arena. And so as Vilas was just referencing and touching on, organizations like Skoll, endowed foundations that have significant capital that we sit on, have an opportunity to activate not just the grant making and the program dollars, and really thinking about enabling organizations, nonprofits, those working on the problems to do their work, but also to allocate capital, right? And we allocate capital in ways that put us in a position to reinforce what we're doing on the program side with actual dollars on the what I will describe as the commercial side of our foundation. When a foundation invests in its endowment in alignment with the core mission, it really compounds that impact, right? It really drives much, much more rapid adoption of social change, at least has that potential. And so at Skoll, the way that looks is in partnership with Capricorn Investment Group, which is our investment manager on our endowment. We are entirely impact investors. We are focused on investing significantly in climate technology, green energy, and we are looking now at how we also add a racial justice lens and an economic inclusion lens in what we are doing. And I'll just to get specific and give an example of what that means. We are looking at parts of our communities that have been excluded from capital, right? That have not had the opportunity to access capital through the traditional kinds of capital allocation systems. And we are allocating specifically to underrepresented fund managers, to first-time fund managers, to funds that are focused on creating new kinds of capital in terms of asset classes. Organizations like APHIS and Heritage, which is ANH, which is a fund that focuses on partnering with employee stock ownership plans and puts the workers in a position to be able to buy their business from incumbent owners that are contemplating retirement or looking for opportunities to exit. And rather than going through the traditional channels, there's an opportunity to put workers in a position to have a much greater economic experience and a much greater economic stake in the businesses that they work in. So as an organization, we are now able to drive an economic inclusion lens alongside our grant making in that arena by really focusing and activating that commercial aspect of it as well, and putting that capital to work in that way. And so that's one of the things that I have been keenly focused on. As Jane mentioned early on, I've been an entrepreneur. I have done battle with these capital allocation systems and tried to shake some capital loose out of that system myself. I know what that looks like, and I'm really interested in seeing change in that space. And I think foundations can play a significant role in looking at the two sides of the organizations that we really are. I see Jane maybe back here. So Jane, if you're able to jump in, please feel free. Otherwise, Vilas can jump in here and pick up that thread on foundations as well.
Yeah. Oh, Jane, I think we still can't hear you, so maybe I'll respond.
Yeah, I mean, what's happening is I think Sam is muting me, but okay. But go ahead, jump in.
Well, what an amazing statement from Marla, and I do want to pick up on it. I know that you've talked, Marla, about the full balance sheet, that idea of using all of the capital at play. And to extend and build on that, one of the things as I came newly into the world of philanthropy was not just to see institutions and foundations as repositories of public capital, asked to kind of make grants, think about the full balance sheet, but really to think of them as repositories of public trust. Mm. And in that framing where we are responsible not just for using these resources that have been given for good purpose but also to use the trust that is put into the sector to do good things. Our extension of that has been similarly to follow through on things like participatory practices in our grant making, even right here at home in Boston, as we begin to think about how we bridge the digital divide, to not simply make grants and ask for outcomes, but to really engage in learning journeys with communities who are trying to understand how to navigate this incredibly complex environment around technology access. But second, to also think about what it looks like as an institution to move beyond grant capital to providing technical expertise, to providing direct support around data maturity, or figuring out how these topics of AI might integrate with areas of particular passion or purpose for philanthropists or for organizations. And in that, I come back to some of Kumi's comments earlier today, where he spoke about the idea of the need for reinventing not just philanthropic practice, but a fundamental idea of what it means to be a philanthropist or a philanthropic organization. How do we extend beyond the idea of grant making to really becoming partners in the social transformation that we see to be necessary, that we hear from the communities we serve are what we all want to get to? That's where I think the real excitement around the next evolution of our philanthropic institutions looks like.
If I can just add to that for a minute, it's wonderful that McGovern and Skoll are providing great examples of how we use all of our capital for good and commit ourselves to that. But I also want to remind us that donor-advised fund holders in 2019 contributed $25 billion to charity. So how do we help those DAF holders who have all their assets in institutions or community foundations? How do we help them move their assets towards social investing, but even more so to impact? And I think that we really need a conversation with all of the institutions. I know for myself, being at a community foundation, you have to ask as a donor. You have to ask for the organization, the institution, to set up funds for you to invest in, to move your money. But there's tremendous resources there that I think are not being fully utilized.
And I'm not sure if I'm still muted. Am I?
Good.
You can hear me. Yeah. I was being muted by the central location, so there was no way for me to unmute. So this is all proof that you actually don't need a moderator in life. But it's also a sign that when your dog Otis wants to join the conversation, he gets in, but I don't get in. So excuse me for this occasional snout coming from a dog. So I don't know what you've covered in the last 10 minutes, but let me just sort of say, what I'll do is I'll jump in a different spot, because the little bit I've just heard, it is about how philanthropy is being reimagined itself, and is in process of that. And presumably that's part of building back better, right? And so reimagining generosity more broadly, because it's not just, as you say, Vilas, or Marla, it's not just grant making. I wanted to take us to some of the as you think about building back better, what else needs to be reimagined? How do we think, Marla? I mean, I think back to your role both at the Center for Inclusive Economy at MasterCard, and also your leadership at Skoll. How are you thinking about reimagining our economy, reimagining capital economy, so that it is not about the extraordinary disparities that currently exist?
One of the big pieces for us, and that I am a strong believer in, both informed by my experiences in corporate, as an entrepreneur, and even to a certain extent as in the public sector, as you mentioned, as a regulator, I think a lot about bringing to life the term stakeholder capitalism, right? Really looking at what it means to not just have stakeholder primacy, but instead think about all of the constituencies that businesses are in fact serving. That includes employees, that includes their customers, that includes their community, it includes our environment, and making decisions that are informed by and that reflect what is best across all of those considerations. Examples of how Skoll has been engaged in that arena: we invested in Imperative 21, it's just a B Lab founding steward, and it's a business-led network that equips leaders to challenge the notion of stakeholder primacy, exactly as I've talked about. What we're looking there is to build a community and build buy-in around this notion that what is better for all of those constituencies is in fact better for business. It is in the long term actually better for all stakeholders. I would argue it's even better for shareholders as well. That entirely focused on a single metric and a single dimension is in and of itself problematic. As I think about what it means to build back better, it is about putting in place systems, criteria, measures, and metrics that will ultimately tie back to the health and I'll use the term payoff, if you will, for all of those constituencies, right? We look at supporting communities and community change leaders like PolicyLink, that's been at the forefront of this work in the United States. It's uplifting voices and solutions that have been most impacted around economic policy and getting them engaged in the conversation. It's about organizations like the Families and Workers Fund, which is a collaborative effort to support solutions that drive long-term structural change around what is best for workers and enabling an equitable recovery for the health and the economic crisis from the health and economic crisis caused by COVID-19. So those are some of the examples that I would really highlight in terms of looking at who can bring voice to some of the communities that may not have had a voice as we've gone through what we've been through now over the last 18 months in COVID, and really thinking about what we learned in the past financial crisis, where we are as we recover from this, and hopefully getting some of those incremental perspectives reflected and taken into account and embedding that in how we evaluate success.
It's interesting, Vilas, the way Marla sort of started with the purpose of the corporation, right? I mean, it is a normative change. And that's what you're seeking in the world of technology. So talk a little bit about the sort of the idea on which the two fields you're most interested in, AI and data science, what their role is, what role they can play, and how they set their own standards for how those tools are used.
Sure. Well, I will share with you, Jane, that my quest is less about normalizing power in technology and really about restructuring structures of power in our society. As an off note, I will say in a conversation about passion and purpose, I'm rarely well moderated. So thank you for joining, and I'll try to contain myself. But I'll say two things. I mean, one is we have in some cases stepped into a conversation where we're quite suspicious of organizations and the people that work in them. And particularly when it comes to the field of technology, we say tech companies are doing bad things in the world. I think it's so important for us to come back to our roots and recognize that institutions may have bad incentives, but people have good hearts. And the idea that technologists aren't technology companies, that technology products aren't the best expression always of what a technologist wants. I offer that example because it goes to something much more core to our idea of what building back better looks like, which is we've built up walls, I think, around the social sector. And in doing so, we've insulated and protected ourselves and been able to function well. But there is an idea of a world where we create a much more porous set of borders between the worlds of technology companies and civil society, between government and the institutions that support government and its service, that let us align back to core ideas of the fact that we're here to pursue justice together. That even when there are market incentives to create products and there are problems that have no market incentives against them, we can still bring our same ingenuity, our innovation, our capacity to create solutions to those problems. I think getting to that place of saying capitalism isn't necessarily the problem, it's not a structure that needs to be addressed, it's the fundamental and underlying conception of power that sits underneath it. Why is it that we're okay with a world in which vulnerability not just exists, but is propagated by our actions? Why is it that equity, a conversation that we're having now in the construct of race, hasn't been the primary conversation we've been having for the last 50 years? And so even inside of our organization, as we think about what our values as a team are, they start from a place of pursuing dignity and thinking about justice, but they always come back to the idea of radiating joy, of thinking about a love for humanity that drives all of our philanthropic activity. Even when I'm sitting here talking about algorithmic bias and fairness in a coding structure, there's still a core humanity that sits underneath that action. I think that's always worth acknowledging.
Karen, we got a great big smile from you at that moment. Jump in.
I love that, because we've been talking a lot about systems and structures, but we really have to talk about the human heart too. That's in all of the grant makers, all the impact investors in this space, and all the individual donors who really want to do something good in the world. But as Yvonne Moore said in the chat earlier in this conference, we have to be responsible grant makers, responsible givers and donors. And what does that mean? We have to take responsibility for educating ourselves, but doing the deep internal work, the introspection, to look at our own personal privilege and power and how that's creating blinders, how that's preventing us from solving the problems that are defined by the people that we're trying to serve. So as an individual, again, an individual donor, I want to keep beating the drum about community, about bringing individuals, whether they be grant makers or individual donors or investors, together to talk to each other, to be vulnerable together, to say, what are we doing right? What are we doing wrong? And just like you were saying, Vilas, how can we continue to find joy in this? Because the only way we're going to create a social norm around global giving, which now is only 5% of all US philanthropy, is if we make it joyful, if we make it something that people are going to want to do. So one example of that is there are 2,000 giving circles around the US right now. Only a handful of them focus globally. What can we do about that? How can we seed more global giving circles? How can we provide more educational opportunities to reach those staff holders and inspire them about global giving? There's so much we can do. And that's why we created this symposium with TPI and NEID, because we want to bring people together to create relationships that will continue after this conference so that we can find the joy together. So thanks for bringing that up, Vilas.
So I think what's been striking, though, about all three of your philanthropies, I don't know whether I'm coming through, am I?
Yeah.
Okay, because you guys still freeze on my screen. Is that all three of you are involved in building an ecosphere, in building networks? In the case of Marla, it's the networks of social entrepreneurs. In the case of Vilas, it's the networks of technologists who are focused on technology for good. You two, both in New England, Karen, but in all of your efforts, not only have you connected donors, but you've also connected those who are advocates for human rights who are in different communities around the world. So talk a little bit about why that is important to all three of you. Why has it been important to not only lift certain grantees, but to embed them in something larger so that learning continues? And Karen, you can keep it on philanthropists as well as on the activists that you support. Vilas, why is it important in your work?
Sure. Well, I can start from a personal story. I mean, I've only recently come to the world of philanthropy. And I think if it wasn't for organizations like NEID and TPI, I wouldn't have met probably some of the best philanthropic leaders I've run into. But also, and maybe just as importantly, wouldn't have had the spaces to engage with these fundamental questions in ways that it's places where it's okay to be vulnerable, to acknowledge that we don't have answers, that we have the possibility of ideation that doesn't necessarily have to be in a space of judgment. I think stepping into this role now as head of a large institution in the space, the same principles and structures and values still apply. Marla and I were speaking yesterday about our shared interest to find leaders in philanthropies, but really activists across the space that are able to share not just our shared experiences, but to bring to us kind of a differentiation and a creation of different strategies, of different approaches, of different local spaces. As we do it, particularly in the field of technology, there is something there that says, as we all learn together, we each learn in our own contexts. So we have organizations that we support and partner with that might have a very specific challenge they're trying to address. But wisdom doesn't come simply from a single experience. It comes from a community that knits experiences together to create common and shared purpose. And that's really, I think, what the great value of this is at every level of the ecosystem.
And Marla, Skoll Foundation is sort of the champion in building of an ecosphere. Tell us not only the theory, but the this is the most chaotic moderating I've ever done. Not only the theory, but the result.
Absolutely, yeah, and we've all been there on having things break at exactly the wrong time. So no worries, Jane. I think everybody on the call can relate. You're handling it gracefully. I think. From what we've seen, and one of the things, and similar to Vilas, right? I'll tell just a little bit of personal experience there. there are, the path to change and building and solving the kinds of problems that we are here and we are fueling people to go and solve is a long and difficult path. It is filled with setbacks and unexpected detours and losing ground, gaining ground, and being able to persist through all of that is best accomplished with some support, right? With some like-minded individuals that have creatively solved some of those problems or overcome similar challenges. And if nothing else, can at least let you know that you're not in this by yourself, right? That there are similar people fighting side by side, maybe figuring out how to solve similar problems from their particular perspective, where they may be best positioned to fight that part of the fight. Gives you a little bit of a boost, right? To keep, to pick yourself back up when you've experienced a setback and get back in and continue pushing from where you may be best positioned. There is also the sharing of best practices, right? Some of the lessons learned the very hard way, right? We learn lessons the hard way as entrepreneurs. We learn lessons the hard way as grassroots in the field actors. And we learn lessons actually the hard way as philanthropists, right? Where there have been instances where we have, philanthropy has a long history and has not always been on the right side of what philanthropy has funded. And learning from some of that is important as well. So I think the collective and the wisdom in many respects of that collective really over time pays off, because it does foster the kind of resilience you really need to stick in a fight for 5 to 10, 15 years, some cases, about driving change around deeply entrenched problems, not expecting that those problems didn't get built overnight. Those problems are not going to change or go away overnight as well. And so what we have really seen is the power of that shared experience and that shared commitment leads to just kind of a multiplicative and compounding effect when we bring people together. So that really informs our emphasis on connectivity and bringing people into groups and building networks.
Yep. And this concept of resilience, Karen, and perseverance, when we first started the Global Philanthropy Forum, the reason for wanting to embed donors into a bigger network of fellow donors was that these were people who had not experienced failure. Much as what is said in Silicon Valley about learning from failure, in fact, most of them were people who haven't failed. And so we worried that the first time they had a setback in philanthropy, they would head for the hills, and that if they were giving alongside others or interacting with others who had experienced failure, they would persevere. They'd be willing to stick with it. Has that been at any piece of your thinking in building the network in New England?
Absolutely. When we can create a vulnerable space or a brave space, we all can do so much better. When we can talk about where our egos have gotten in the way, where our blinders have gotten in the way. We learn from each other. But the other aspect of this network building is the network building on the ground with the grantees. I just wanted to refer to that for a minute, because some of my most rewarding investments in philanthropy have been in these networks of educators, networks of peasants in Haiti. When you can help peasants share information about how they grow their crops or how they get them to market, or what their rights are in society, they band together, they become a louder voice. And we've seen that over and over again, that if you're investing in the grassroots, connect these groups together so that they then can create a social movement. So it's just another alternative path in philanthropy.
Yeah. And Sam, you can put up questions if you would, because I can't see them from here. Let me just sort of take you back to Malala's words. I know that you've felt the power of so many of the speakers, but I just happen to know how moved you were by Malala. And one of the things she said, and I wanted to see if this rings true for you, is that yes, when it comes to social change, when it comes to really solving hard problems, and coming up against being the nonconformist that Marla spoke of coming up against social mores and sort of expectations, that the voice needs to come from not us. The voice needs to come from the ground. It needs to come from that girl in that community.
Right.
But says Malala, they need to be strengthened and reassured by the fact that there's a much wider community that crosses borders of girls like her or boys. So say something about that. Does that ring true for you?
Oh,
And how has that guided your giving?
absolutely, completely. But not but, and these individuals who are homegrown leaders, they need support. They need technical assistance. They need to be connected to each other. They need the cash, of course. They need other skills. They need organizational strengthening. There are roles for us to play, of course, but it's their voices that matter. It's their solutions that we need to fund. They are the heroes for us.
We're seeing, Marla, and during the period of the pandemic, I'm now taking us back to the sort of philanthropy reimagined. I mean, you guys were leaders in the whole notion of supporting social entrepreneurs. You were real leaders in the idea of really giving them a very large latitude, not being directive at all as givers, but championing and celebrating. You've been leaders now in leveraging the whole balance sheet. In the last year, have you seen innovations in philanthropy, changes in attitudes that come with the pandemic, that come with a kind of inability to sometimes work with the nonprofit, but in fact, without that kind of infrastructure right around you?
Yeah, I do think that there have been some changes, and I think the entire sector is on notice now with some novel ways that philanthropy can in fact be practiced, right? That the intensive and extensive diligence, that the relative conservatism and kind of risk aversion that is characterized, that I have found surprisingly has characterized philanthropy for long periods of time, that the demand for specific reporting that may be idiosyncratic for each funder. So these organizations are put in a position of having to generate, volumes in some cases of very specific kinds of output information in order to keep going, in order to satisfy the funders. All of that, I think, has been put on the table for reevaluation. I think very actively informed by what we've seen from Mackenzie Scott and the way that she and a number of others have appeared and really been willing to make meaningful grants that are in significant size, in some cases larger than some of these organizations may have seen ever in their existence, and are not putting them through any of those things. They're not making an ask about reporting. They're not making significant and extensive asks around diligence, and are not putting program requirements attached to the dollar. That is general operating support. That is oftentimes the scarcest and hardest to find. It's where we have long been committed, is to providing that general operating support, and that there have been creative, smart, committed people that have come up with this. Let them stay committed and continue doing what strikes them as the best way to address these problems and get engaged. So we are really excited to see the entire sector move more in that direction, and really trust that those closest to the problem, that those that have been actively engaged in this work, are best positioned to continue to do that. And that now having to answer to a funder that is by definition a degree removed from it, maybe deeply committed to it, but are not sort of hands-on and doing this day to day, that what they need is fuel, right? And what they really need is support and again, some of that connectivity, but not an additional layer of overhead, right? Or additional set of asks around it. And so while that doesn't necessarily sound specifically innovative, I guess what I would describe it as kind of revolutionary, right? In terms of really putting this industry, this sector in a place where we can actually be much, much better partners and get these and put people in a position to work toward their ultimate change with much more confidence and urgency.
And it has allowed, I would sort of add a point, it has allowed program officers and individual funders to look beyond those grantees who are particularly good at writing a good proposal,
Exactly.
or particularly good at understanding what an evaluation, should look like, even if it's irrelevant to the work they're doing. It does allow for a more diverse set of grantees. Have you found that, Karen?
I don't know about that, honestly, that particular question, but I was thinking about Mackenzie Scott and her brilliance in funding the ecosystem of philanthropy, funding organizations like TechSoup that are mapping, nonprofits all over the world, Giving Tuesday, again, democratizing philanthropy, funding the National Center for Family Philanthropy. She understands that if we invest in the networks of philanthropy, we can lift all boats. So I really applaud her for that.
Yeah, and I would add that her investment in historically Black colleges and universities.
Yes, exactly. Another
infrastructure creating move. Vilas, Marla used a magic word as far as I'm concerned, and that's the word trust. In the last year, philanthropy has decided to place much more trust in the grantee, and it turned out to be well-founded, right? What has trust meant in your work?
Yeah, I love the word, Jane. And really, of everything Marla said, I wish we could go back and underline it and put a highlighter around it. Such an eloquent frame for, I think, the way we should all be thinking about this. But trust in particular for us starts at a few different places. The first is inside of our institution. How do we build an environment where we trust each other to have the right intentions? I name that in this conversation in particular because sometimes philanthropies have let me not mince words, a bureaucratic aspect to them, an affect to them, right? What does it look like to actually build a team of individuals that bring their passions and their interests and have the trust of the institution to go out and trust our partners in the world? To know that to do trust-based philanthropy doesn't first require an internal administrative process to define what that looks like and make sure it is approved, but rather to express out to the world the fact that we're really here as partners. The second facet there is one around what risk means in the construct of trust. One of the classical constructions is that philanthropies are supposed to be risk-taking capital or, take on risk. I don't agree with that. I think our role is not so much to take on risk as to take risk away from our partners that are doing good in the world, to make it easier for them to do the work that they do and to take their risk onto us, to let them say, we trust you. We know you're going to do well. And if you don't, understand that those failures won't be failures of character or they'll be failures of circumstance. And that's okay. And the final bit around trust is the humility to understand that many, many decades of philanthropic practice, as it's led to what we think of best practices today, might not be the best possible way to do things. That maybe we should step forward with the humility to say, we need to go back and reassess the very basic suppositions of what philanthropy is about. I spent a number of years before stepping into this professional role kind of living around the world in communities that I was particularly interested in supporting. And in places ranging from Dhaka to Sub-Saharan Africa to Southeast Asia, to actually embed inside of a community and see what it meant to be a recipient of aid, or to have a village that was supported by international nonprofits. And I learned that the language of interactions there, the way that those who are actually doing the work on the ground interact with the citizens and communities, is a different vernacular. It's a different language of philanthropy than what I hear in boardrooms here in the US. When we talk about oversight, when we talk about metrics, when we talk about evaluation, when we talk about reporting, that's not the same thing as when is the money coming that's going to allow that water fitting to be installed so that our well can actually provide water for our village. And I think that question around trust becomes, how do we trust those communities to be able to direct our processes, our mechanisms, our evaluation in ways that let us move forward?
One more final word from you, Marla, on trust as well.
Yep, happy to. And I'll wrap this into one of the questions that was raised by the audience. We got one of the questions here was really looking at the history of philanthropy, and that in many instances, some of the wealth that was generated in philanthropy was generated during, in an inequitable system where there was not equitable access to resources, and how we think about the role of philanthropy in fixing that issue. And I think trust actually is very much part of how that is addressed and how that manifests itself in looking at and using the endowments, the access, the business, the responsibility of philanthropy is about trusting that we are not best positioned, we are not the closest to it, we are oftentimes really the stewards of an asset that is intended to create better access, right? That access itself is part and parcel of driving the way to address that, and that is about ensuring that those who have not had access now are front and center and very much considered. That when we look at leadership in philanthropy, and philanthropy itself has had many of the same characteristics, that leadership can in and of itself change. That is not sufficient, right? It is not just putting a new face on same kinds of behaviors, but that there are different lived experiences, and that those voices are themselves empowered to be decision makers and shift some of this and some of these outcomes. I think importantly, one of the part of it is also recognition, right? And part of and just sort of learning and understanding the history itself. That puts us in a position to be functioning from a much more informed perspective. A lot of the history has been obscured. It has been deliberately characterized in very specific ways to accomplish goals. And building that shared understanding, again, that goes back to trust, is very much how I look at the opportunity within philanthropy to address that inequity and move us in a very different direction.
This is the reason so many of us are so thrilled that you are now part of philanthropy. So, Marla, Karen, I'm going to give you the last word. We opened with you, and I want to close with you. Given the role that you've played in making this symposium happen, and the leadership role you've played in philanthropy more broadly.
Oh, thank you, Jane. What I think about a lot is how we can all work together to make global giving and global philanthropy a social norm. How are we going to get some of the other 95% of the dollars that are contributed in this country to go to solve global problems? As Kumi Nato said, humanity is 1 minute before midnight. And we cannot address climate catastrophe by just giving domestically. So how are we going to do this? I think one of the ways we can do this is we can all leave this gathering committed to talking to people in our own personal networks about how inspired we were, what we're going to do afterwards. There were two sociologists, James and Christakis, who came up with a concept of 3 degrees of influence. 3 degrees of influence. It's not the same as 6 degrees of connection. We influence people 3 degrees out from our own circles. If we have a circle of 20 people, and those 20 people have another circle of 20 people, and each of those 20 people has another circle of 20 people, that's 8,000 people. If we change our behavior, if we start talking about how exciting it is, how rewarding it is, how imperative it is that we fund internationally, we can reach 8,000 people, each one of us. If there are 300 people at this conference, that's about 2.4 million people we will reach to create a new social norm around giving internationally. So that's the charge that I want to leave everyone with. And I want to thank you so much, Jane and Vilas and Marla, for joining with us and helping to conclude a wonderful 3 days.
So thank you, Karen and Marla and Vilas. And now we're going to turn to our leaders, both Baggy and Ina, to close out the conference. Thank you.
Thank you.
Wow, this was incredible. Thank you so much for an amazing, amazing roundtable. Jane, you are a fantastic moderator. Despite the technical issues, we've actually enjoyed getting to see dogs during this COVID pandemic that has us all virtual. So we really want to thank you, Jane, and thank you, Vilas, and thank you, Karen, and thank you, Marla. What an amazing capstone to an unbelievable symposium. I don't know about you, but I There's just so much rich content. It's going to take a while to digest, but we will, and we will be circling back with all of you. I'd like to, as you know, a symposium like this is really impossible to put off by yourself, right? It really takes a team. And we've had an amazing team to get us through these past 3 days. We've had incredible sponsors. We've had incredible advisors. We've had the team of NEID, of New England International Donors. We've had the team of the Philanthropic Initiative. They have been working tirelessly, incredible teammates. And we'd also like to thank our partners in South Africa, staying up late on a Friday night to help deliver this great symposium. Thank you to Virtual Co and to our team members there. And with that, I'm gonna throw the football over to you, Ina, to end to take us home.
Thank you so much, Maggie. And maybe I should just end by thanking all of you for such an inspiring conversation. Believe it or not, we've had, over the last 3 days, 40 sessions, 93 speakers, over 360 people in total signed in. I think 300 every day, which is amazing, and from 25 countries. So going back to what Karen said, this just shows the potential wide impact that we can have with what we learned today. So let me just, in closing, close with a African proverb that I believe Anu said in her partnership workshop on the first day, which is, if you go quickly, go alone. And if you want to go far, go it together. So we want to go together with you. Thank you, everybody, and have a great weekend.